Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's live online webinar, a reading and Q&A with Guy Tal, author behind our newly released publication, The Interior Landscape, the landscape on both sides of the camera, reflections on art, creativity, expression, and a life in photography. We're going to be getting started in just a minute to give participants some time to enter. In the meantime, please feel free to share with us in the chat your name and where you're tuning in from. Welcome, everyone. If you've just joined us and you're here for our live online webinar, a reading and Q&A with Guy Tal, you've come to the right place. We will be getting started in just a minute. While we wait for our attendees to enter the webinar, please feel free to share with us in the chat and where you're joining us from. So far, it looks like we're represented by the US, Canada, and I think even Australia. All right, we may have some more participants who will be joining us in progress, but for now, we're going to get started. A couple of things to note for those of you who are here. If you have to leave this webinar for any reason, we will be recording this and emailing it to all those who registered. Whatever questions you have for Guy throughout the webinar, please enter those into the Q&A function of your chat bar. I will be moderating those throughout the webinar. And now to introduce myself as your host and moderator. My name is Katie Walker, and I'm the marketing coordinator at Rocky Nook. For those of you who are unfamiliar to Rocky Nook, we are a small independent publisher local to the Bay Area in San Francisco. Rocky Nook was founded in 2006 with the goal of publishing books that would help all level photographers improve their skills to capture those moments that matter. We are delighted to host Guy Tal as we celebrate his new book, The Interior Landscape. If you have yet to purchase Guy's book, you can do so online from Rocky Nook's store using a coupon code to save 40% off the print, ebook, and bundle. That coupon code I'll enter into the chat is TAL, T-A-L 40. We ask that if you buy and use Guy's book, that you leave him a review online, as this helps both us as the publisher, but namely helps Guy as an artist, author, and educator. And now to introduce Guy. Guy Tal spent the first 26 years of his life in Israel, where he was born, served a mandatory military service, and studied and taught at the Tel Aviv University. As a youth, he loved to explore the natural areas around his home by the Mediterranean Sea, as well as the Negev Desert and the Golan Heights. At odds with the political turmoil and rampant urbanization of his homeland, Guy immigrated to California, where he embarked on a career in information technology. He also began an enduring love affair with the wild places of the American West. Guy ultimately settled in a tiny remote town at the foot of Utah's Aquarius Plateau, on the edge of Utah's famous canyon country, a place that inspires him deeply and where he practices most of his work. A lifelong learner and explorer, Guy's interest in art, science, and philosophy converged with his intense love of wild places, which he expresses through his photography and his writing. He is a public speaker, educator, and frequent contributor to several photographic publications. Guy's first book, More Than a Rock was published by Rocky Nook in 2015. Subsequently, he has published The Landscape Photographer's Guide to Photoshop in 2017 and More Than a Rock, second edition in 2021, also by Rocky Nook. Analemma Press published his 2021 publication, Another Day Not Wasted, and tonight we celebrate his newest release with Rocky Nook, The Interior Landscape. Please join me in welcoming Guy Tal.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. You give me some indication that you can. All right. Yeah, the Zoom thing is kind of weird. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for being here. A lot of familiar names. So great to see you here. What we're going to do this evening is I'm going to read to you some passages from the new book, and obviously open the stage for you guys to ask questions, have a good conversation, and a pleasant evening. So I think to get started, I will read to you the introduction for the book, because that sort of sets the stage for what the book is about, the general theme of the book. And hopefully you guys will have more questions as we go on. Okay, so this is the introduction. In his book, Crossing Open Ground, the late writer Barry Lopez distinguished between two landscapes: the exterior landscape, which he describes as the one we see, and the interior landscape, which he described as a kind of projection within a person of a part of the exterior landscape. Each landscape has its own elements and relationships, but the two also interrelate, Lopez explained. The interior landscape responds to the character and subtlety of the exterior landscape. The shape of the individual mind is affected by land as it is by genes. The term landscape photography may be used to describe photographs of the exterior landscape, the one we see. The term may also be used to describe expressive photographs reflecting the interior landscape, the one each of us carries within. Each person's interior landscape is unique and largely invisible to the eye. Still, if we know something about the way one's interior landscape may be affected by elements of the exterior landscape, we may use these elements to express our own interior landscapes and to affect other people's interior landscapes. Such is the purpose of landscape photography practiced as expressive art. Photographic artists aiming to express subjective notions, aspects of their interior landscape in their work, often find themselves at odds with those who, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, still believe that quote-unquote true photography consists only of objective representation of the exterior landscape. What is truth? Asked Friedrich Nietzsche. He then answered his own question: a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred, and embellished, and which, after long usage, seem to a people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions. Truthfulness is not a quality imposed by any medium. It is a quality of information relative to context. Just as information exists in many forms and may assume different meanings in different contexts, so too does truth come in many varieties. There is objective truth and subjective truth. There is truth to appearances and truth to feelings. There is literal truth and metaphorical truth. The truth of art is not necessarily the truth of nature, just as the truth of a metaphor is not necessarily the truth of its words taken literally. Being literal or metaphorical, in turn, is not a measure of the value or greatness of the truth expressed. However, failing to account for the distinction, treating literal truth as metaphor or metaphorical truth as literal, may lead to great errors and misunderstanding. This is what Johann Wolfgang von Goethe meant when he wrote, "The genuine law-giving artist strives for the truth of art. The lawless artist who follows a blind impulse strives for the reality of nature. Through the former, art reaches its highest summit. Through the latter, its lowest stage." As an avid naturalist and outdoorsman, I began my journey in photography more than 3 decades ago, striving to document the exterior landscape, the truth of nature, believing that no form of beauty can improve upon natural aesthetics. Today, I am an expressive artist striving to express my own internal landscape, the truth of art. I still believe that the natural aesthetics cannot be improved upon. What I was lacking in my earlier years, the linchpin connecting my love of natural beauty with qualities of my inner experiences, was an understanding of art, and an understanding that the truth of art is not in contradiction with the truth of nature. Art, wrote Paul Cézanne, is a harmony parallel to nature. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy proclaimed, "The illiterate of the future will be the person ignorant of the use of the camera as well as the pen." To be photographically literate means, among other things, to recognize that some photographs are intended as reportage, others as art. Some photographs are meant as objective illustrations, others as subjective expressions. Some photographs are best understood literally, others metaphorically. Some photographs aim to portray the truth of the exterior landscape, others the truth of the photographer's interior landscape. In this collection of essays, I hope to help readers consider landscape photography as art, as expressions of a photographer's interior landscape, distinct from landscape photography as objective representations of the exterior landscape.
Hi. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to ask a question and then we want to open things up to the audience. My question has two parts. I would love to know what in you or about you may have changed from the writing of your last publication to now.
So the last publication, I assume you mean the book Another Day Not Wasted. What has changed in me? That's really hard to say. My life is generally very turbulent. I'm a kind of person that gets bored with things very quickly. I'm constantly looking for new things to learn and new things to do and new things to try. So among the things that changed in my life, some have been less fortunate than others. I've an ongoing illness that I've been struggling with, and that has shaped many of my experiences. But at the same time, it has only made me appreciate my my time and my experiences in nature more. And I've been striving more than ever to spend a lot of my time outside and to spend a lot of my time writing and photographing expressively. As far as what changed, I think I've become more focused on I wouldn't necessarily call it a mission, but something that I really want to leave as sort of a mark or a legacy of what I've done, which is really make my own contribution, however small, to the appreciation of photography as art. And that's a very distinguished legacy. It started with, people like Henry Peach Robinson and Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Weston and Paul Strand, and then later on Ansel Adams and Minor White. And all of them have made some contributions, but I feel that in the last few decades, photography has been fairly stagnant in this arena of realism and mimetic objective representation. And I would like to help prompt artists, photographic artists, to think more expressively and more subjectively in their work.
The second part of my question was, you have 3 books of essays that I'm aware of, or 4 if you count the first edition and second edition of More Than a Rock. And I am wondering if you were to talk to someone who is unfamiliar with your work and they wanted to ask where they would start, which book would you recommend? Is there a timeline, or can you jump in anywhere? Does one lead to another? I'm sure they're all in conversation with one another, but I would love to know what you think.
In a sense, it's almost all of the above, because, and I've spoken with people who have read the books non-sequentially, just picked articles that looked interesting and they got some value out of it. And so that's definitely a possibility. If I had it my way, I would recommend that you read them in the order that they were published. And the reason for that is that the first book, More Than a Rock, was really a lot of essays that I've written over a long period of time. It covers a very broad range of topics, and then I try to distill that into 4 semi-distinct categories in order for the articles to make sense. But really that's the foundation for a lot of later thinking that came in the later books. And so in Another Day Not Wasted, I decided to take a little step back and write a little more autobiographically about my own experiences, how I became the photographer that I became, including some of my personal and professional history that brought me to where I am, and the philosophy of life that I've evolved as a result of that journey. and that explains some of the attitudes in More Than Iraq. And the new book, The Interior Landscape, is yet another step beyond that, of focusing more on what I want to do, what I'd like to accomplish in my work, now that you understand where I'm coming from and who I am.
Yeah. Thank you. We do have some audience questions in the Q&A that I'd like to ask. And audience, we do have a number of passages that Guy will be reading from us. So if I don't get to your question right away, we will stagger those and just weave those in between his readings. So the first question from Monica is, how much self-awareness is needed to capture images that represent the interior landscape successfully?
I think a fairly high degree. And for me, one of the paths, or one of the things that have shaped my life most profoundly, was the practice of mindfulness. And mindfulness has two facets to it. One is being very acutely aware of things that are happening in the world outside of you in real time as they happen. And the other side is understanding what's happening within you. And if you practice meditation, part of what meditation teaches you is to recognize when random thoughts and feelings just bubble up in your mind. Most people don't realize when this is happening, and then their mood is shaped based on these things, sometimes without them even realizing it. But if you meditate and you become very self-aware, you can see, you can feel those emotions as they come up. You can become conscious of them as they happen, and thoughts and ideas. And then you have conscious control over what to do with them. If you're a very practiced meditator, you can sometimes even take some of these feelings that are not productive and set them aside and refocus your attention on something else. But more productively is if you have some ideas, some hints of some interesting things that come up into your mind. Sometimes if you don't give them proper attention, they will just be replaced by other things. And so becoming really self-aware is taking note of these. And what I do is I take a lot of notes as thoughts come into my mind. As soon as something feels even a little bit useful, or something that I might want to evolve or write about or think about more later, I immediately write it down so I have it available to me. So yeah, I would definitely think that it requires a fairly high degree of self-awareness.
The next question from Psycat is, do you feel you have finally come to the peace of wild things, to quote from Wendell Berry, another poet, or do you feel it is a lifelong process?
I hate to admit it, but I don't think that piece that he's describing is something that's within my repertoire. I'm just not a very peaceful minded person by nature. I constantly have things rattling around in my head. But yeah, being in nature and being focused and mindful of nature is definitely a way for me to distill and to quiet down a lot of that chaos that's constantly going on in my mind. But to be completely at peace, I don't think that's within my reach.
That's fair. We have one question from Yvonne, and then I'd like to get on to your next passage. So audience, please feel free to keep adding more questions, but we'll just get to those after the next passage. Yvonne asks, interesting, the interior, so this is a little bit of a commentary and a question. Interesting, the interior and exterior landscapes are similar to the concepts of cognitive and physical models in human communications. The challenge of good communication is to be able to convey and translate our cognitive model into physical models, photographs in our case. To succeed, the message sender must know the language used by the receiver. In photography, this means knowledge of the emotional impact of visual variables, example, colors, textures, line shape, orientation, sharpness, fuzziness. Do you agree with the previous opinion, and do you know of good references to map visual variables to emotions?
Yeah, that is in one variation or another, one of the most common questions that I get in my teaching, because I allude a lot to some of the scientific knowledge that is coming to light now about visual expression. But first of all, we have to acknowledge that visual expression, visual perception is never absolute. It's always going to be ambiguous to some degree because it's influenced both by objective and subjective factors. So there are some factors that are fairly universal that you can assume most or all people will respond to in the same same way, but there is always going to be a subjective component that every viewer brings to the experience. So it's not like if you use words and someone can take a word and look it up in the dictionary and have a fairly decisive, unambiguous definition of what that word means. In visual expression, you don't get that. There is a fair amount of commonality among people, and one of the better references for that, it's now a classic book. You'll probably use it as a textbook if you take a academic classic about it, is a book called Art and Visual Perception by Rudolf Arnheim. And it is founded on Gestalt psychology, experiment in Gestalt psychology. And what he did is he took a lot of these scientific experiments that, try to figure out how people respond to certain things, colors and lines and patterns and juxtaposition and things like that. And he decided to make it applicable for artists. So if you look at the book is divided. It has chapters about colors, about lines, about shapes, and how they affect perception. So that is one very good reference. The more recent and, in my opinion, more interesting, even though it's considerably lacking information in that area, comes from a science called neuroaesthetics. It was started by a person named Samir Zeki, and he wrote one of the original textbook for it, which is extremely technical and scientific, so I'm not sure it'll be very useful to artists, but others have written about this in a more accessible way. One of them is a psychologist named V.S. Ramachandran. He has a book called The Telltale Brain that talks about some of it. Another is Anjan Chatterjee. He has a book. What's the name of the book? Give me 1 second, I'll tell you. The book is called The Aesthetic Brain. But one thing you will realize very quickly is they touch on a lot of these scientific studies that have been done trying to understand what happens in the brain using just things like fMRI machine and PET scans when people are exposed to art. And you'll realize very quickly that we know very, very little about it, that these experiments open the door to just a vast body of knowledge that is yet to be discovered. So that's another useful source. But from the way that I write about it is I think it's extremely important to know what science is available. And then when you realize that the available science is still lacking, work very hard on developing intuition based on trial and error to see what works and what doesn't work, and try to come up with the sense. This is what artists have always done, is trying to figure out how to create their works in a way that they accomplish the desired emotional effect.
We were prepared for that question.
Well, it's part of my teaching material for a lot of years now. So yeah, it's wired in my brain.
Oh, thank you. If you wouldn't mind reading to us some more.
Of course.
But I also wonder if you can share with audience the book page numbers you were using.
I'm actually reading from an ebook, so I can look at the paper book. Okay, so the book is divided into 4 sections, and I picked a little passage from each section. And this one is from an article titled Commitment and Doubt, which I can look at the table of contents. It is page 70 in the print version. Give me 1 second, I'll find it in the ebook. Okay, so I will read a part of this article. It's a much longer article. Okay, so the article starts with this quotation from a psychologist named Rollo May, who wrote about creativity. He writes, "The relationship between commitment and doubt is by no means an antagonistic one. Commitment is healthiest when it is not without doubt, but in spite of doubt." Okay, starting the article. Paul Cézanne famously said he wanted to die painting, and he did. My commitment to photography is not quite so decisive. I can't say that I want to die photographing or even to die a photographer. Frankly, so long as my death is swift and painless, I don't really care about its circumstances. My commitment to photography is not absolute. It is founded in a simple condition. So long as I find value and meaning in photography, I'll keep doing it. To the degree that I am and have been committed to photography, my commitment has not always been the same. Long ago, photography was just a fun and gratifying thing to do, an enjoyable hobby to augment and to enrich my solitary exploration. It soon became a passion, then an obsession, and then, as is the fate of any long-term relationship, it got considerably more complicated. Some days I feel I can't do without photography, and other days I can't stand the thought of it. Some days photography is a source of happiness, other days a source of despair. Some days photography is a gift, and other days a burden. In my early years as a quote unquote serious photographer, if you asked me why I photograph with such great dedication, I may have responded with some naive trope about photography being my quote unquote creative outlet, or about showing people the beauty of nature, perhaps even contribute to public awareness of the need to conserve wild places. In truth, none of these was ever really, or at least not entirely, the case. At different times, these explanations felt as real as any other I've had. In hindsight, I confess, photography was never something I've done for any particular purpose. I practiced photography because it added yet more enjoyable dimensions to experiences that already were, still are, and likely will always be indispensable to my well-being. My commitment to photography today, and likely tomorrow, and probably also next week, but that's as far as I'm willing to commit, is as my tool of choice for making expressive art. What I mean by this is that photography seems to me so far to be the medium best suited for expressing the kinds of things I most want to express: epiphanies, aesthetics, moods, and feelings inspired by my experiences in the natural world. Just as important, photography for me is about the process of making, not about any predetermined use I may or may not have for the resulting photographs. To me, a photograph becomes much less interesting once I consider it finished. Part of my commitment to photography comes from the fact that the mechanics of the medium allow me to create in places and circumstances that are not as well suited for other media, but that happen to be the places and circumstances where I feel most inspired. Another part of my commitment comes from the long-term rewards I gain by continually training my mind to seek interesting and photogenic subjects. The result of such training is that I have become more mindful and aware of dimensions of my experience, things and relationships, both real and metaphorical, both grand and subtle, that I may otherwise not take notice of. These aspects of photography, its immediacy when I feel inspired, and its long-term benefits in enriching my living experiences, are the primary reasons I'm committed to photography. The resulting photographs, when they are successful, are of course satisfying as well, but not to the same extent. In a 1967 article titled Post-Visualization, photographer Jerry Ullsman wrote, "It is interesting to note that much of the experimental photography that we revere today has been done by individuals whose commitment to photography is but one aspect of their commitment to art." In my case, I would throw another commitment into the mix, my commitment to natural places and the experiences they inspire. It used to be that nature, photography, and art making were so closely related in my mind that I could regard them as perhaps just separate dimensions of one thing, my commitment to life as I wish to live it. But after so many years of living this life, nature, photography, and art have slowly drifted apart for me. Each has become complex and significant enough to warrant its own mode of appreciation and its own manner of commitment. My degree of commitment to each is rooted in a hierarchy of importance. I often doubt my commitment to photography as my artistic medium. I sometimes, but rarely, doubt my commitment to art in the greater sense. But I never doubt my commitment to nature. I will always be a naturalist. I will die a naturalist. I almost certainly will always be an artist of some kind, but I'm at least open to the idea that some other form of expression may someday seem more appealing to me than photography. Beyond sometimes doubting my commitment to photography, I also sometimes doubt my commitment to presenting myself to the world as a photographer. This is not only because I have other passions and interests, but also because of expectations and prejudices that often go with the designation photographer. Most people, I've learned, have a simplistic and often lesser opinion of photography as an art form compared with such things as painting or music. Beyond just having a penchant for quote unquote taking pictures, few consider photography an emotional and intellectual pursuit, in the same sense that poetry or creative writing are. But to me, what to me is a work, to many is a shot. What to me is a creative act, to many is just being in the right place at the right time, if not outright dumb luck. What to me is the culmination of a prolonged experience, to many is just a random moment frozen in time. What to me is subjective expression, to many is objective representation.
As is the fate of any long-term relationship, photography got considerably more complicated.
Yeah, isn't that true?
Love that. Audience are asking some great questions, and I'm just going to jump in. Scott asks, how do you feel and what goes through your mind when you are out in the wilderness and come across a petroglyph? Or, for example, the mortar and pestle that you posted on Facebook the other day.
Um, I do this a lot, not just when I find evidence of humans, but in general, I like to play time lapse sequences in my head, as I see certain geologies and certain things happening. When I find evidence of ancient humans, usually I almost immediately try to imagine what it was like for them to live there. I'm not the world's greatest expert on Native American culture, but I know fairly well the different periods of human habitation in this area. So, I can tell Puebloan evidence from archaic evidence from more recent Ute Paiute evidence, or the differences between Fremont and Pueblo. And so I know a little bit about the cultures that have left these relics, and very often I can tell based on the type and shape, and especially with rock art, what culture had left them, and that gives me a sense of about how long it was since they've been there. Obviously, I don't know exactly what a lot of this art means. I don't think anybody does today, but it helps me envision what that place was like when they lived there. So, for example, sometimes I might find evidence of habitation in a wash that is completely arid and barren, but I know that maybe hundreds of years ago, a couple of thousand years ago, there may have been a trickle of water in that wash, and that's why they lived there. And I try to imagine what crops they grew and how they supported themselves. And sometimes the stories are nice and sometimes not so nice. So, for example, recently I found evidence of habitation in an alcove in a very, very narrow divot in the ground. And there was almost no evidence of activities up on top. So it was inside this really tiny wash. And my guess is people have lived there for decades at least, and almost never went up on top. And my guess is that those people were refugees of some sort. They were afraid to go out. They were afraid to be seen. So they try to live their entire lives within that little crack in the ground and eke out a living out of there. So I try to play the stories in my head of trying to figure out what exactly happened there, why they lived the way that they did, why, where they cooked the meals, what they ate, what it was like to be a child growing up there. I like to try to tell these stories in my mind. So that's usually what I do. And I should add, and maybe I shouldn't, but it's true. A lot of times people ask me about any spiritual connection with the people and, whether I feel their presence. And for me, the answer is no. In fact, if there were people living there, I wouldn't want to be there. So for me, the fact that they left evidence, but they are no longer there is part of my joy in discovering and trying to tell their story.
Yeah. What humanity?
Yeah.
Ed asks, when people familiar with fine art have different interpretations of a piece, has the artist failed to communicate his or her inner feelings? If not, what is the measure?
No, the answer is decisively no. It's not a failure on the artist's part. And there's a lot of evidence in history of great art that was completely misunderstood and not recognized in its day. And I think as artists, that's just something we have to accept, is we can do our best to express something in the way that is most meaningful to us, but we should not compromise that. And if people understand it, great. If people don't understand it, then they don't understand it. Maybe they will someday. But the point is that creativity is about creating something new, and something new is always going to be potentially misunderstood, potentially by a lot of people. But that doesn't mean that we should only stick to templates that are guaranteed and that we know for sure work, because there's not going to be any evolution in art that way. And a lot of the art that we know today as great art has been very revolutionary, sometimes even maligned in its day. But through the courage of artists to do things that have not been done before, to try to help people understand things that they're not used to thinking about, art has contributed a lot to human culture. And so I don't think that a failure of other people to understand your art is necessarily your failure. You have to do things that feel right to you, and maybe the world will catch up with you and maybe it will not, but the important thing is to do what feels right.
Takes courage.
Well, that's exactly what Matisse said, is creativity takes courage.
We have some questions that were pre-submitted before the webinar, and I want to get to our first audience question. This comes from Eileen in Exeter, Rhode Island. Eileen says, besides your images, your writing skills and your wealth of subject matter are stunning. How did you strengthen your writing skills and your ability to expound on one thought? Do you have a process for this?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. As far as building my writing skills, I would say there's three complementary parts to that. One is reading a lot. When you read a lot, you absorb other people's writing style. You learn how to express certain things. The other part is to write a lot. This way you learn, excuse me, this way you learn how to do it yourself. And you get feedback from your audience about what worked and what didn't, and what you managed to express successfully or not. The third part of it might be a little harder for most people to obtain, but I would say find a good editor. And I've noticed that book editors are generally much, much better than magazine editors. Magazine editors rarely give you feedback. They might change things without even telling you, and you won't even know until the piece is published. But book editors, when you send them a manuscript, you will get back detailed notes with all kinds of suggestions. They will come out and tell you if something is not clear, or if you did something that doesn't fit with some manual of style or style guide. And I found that extremely, extremely useful in honing my own skill. That said, every now and then I will open a book by some writer that I admire, and I would just think, there's no way I will ever write this well. So there's always more to learn. But I think learning by doing it a lot, learning by reading a lot is the way to do it. As far as focusing on one subject, that's sort of a challenge, I think, of our age. We have so many distractions in our lives that it's very difficult to focus. It's something that you have to train yourself to do. What I do, as I mentioned earlier, is when I get an idea that comes to my head that I think has potential to become something else, I will immediately write it down so I don't lose it. And then every now and then I will either keep thinking about it, or it'll bubble up in my mind again, and I might think something else about it. I will go back to that previous note and I will add notes to that. And then when the time comes to actually write about it, I will dump everything into a Word document. I will draw a line above it, and then I will start arranging things, composing things in the same way that I think about composing visual elements in the photographs, just trying to relate them to each other so they make sense, so they turn into a narrative.
Another question on writing. Have you found it harder to convey metaphor through writing rather than photography, because words have more decisive meaning than visual cues?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Conversely, have you found that the general audience have a harder time understanding visual metaphors as opposed to written metaphors?
Okay, that's actually a great compliment to the first part. Well, for the first part, I would say the answer is no. Even though words have very decisive meaning, there's a lot of ways to use words metaphorically. I mean, pretty much all of poetry is about using words metaphorically. So there's a very good long history of that. And the second part actually relates to the first part, is some people have a hard time understanding visual metaphors because they're not used to it, especially in photography. When people look at photographs, they innately or expect for it to be very literal and simplistic. They don't look for ulterior meaning. Whereas in creative writing, based on the writing style, if people recognize that it's creative writing, they would expect it to be metaphorical. They would look for the metaphor. They would try to go a step or two further to try to understand what it was that you try to express. So yeah, that is a challenge. Excuse me. That is a challenge for photographers, I think, is that visual metaphors, even if they are successful in the sense that somebody who takes the time to study your image will get your metaphor, most people would not spend that time. Most people see photographs, scrolling by on social media with all kinds of banter and advertising around them, and it's really hard to get people to spend time looking at an image and trying to figure out what it was that you tried to express. So that is a challenge, and that's, like I mentioned, part of what I hope to make a small contribution to in terms of photographic art, is to try to put out metaphorical photographs and to prompt people to consider them metaphorically and not just as pictures of things.
Thank you. I think we're going to ask a couple more questions and then invite you to read another passage. One question from John, which I think this dovetails nicely with what you're talking about. He says, sometimes I view images and paintings that evoke feelings that I do not have the vocabulary to describe, despite having read the works of great writers. Any practical advice on how to understand these feelings so that I may be able to figure out how to translate these feelings into his art?
Okay, so there's two parts to it. One, I would say, is if you think of visual expression and verbal expression as two different media, as two languages, anyone who speaks more than the one language knows that every language has a certain range of expression that can only be expressed properly in that language. There's a lot of overlap. Obviously, you need to be able to express a lot of things in different languages in different ways, but every language develops its own euphemism and its own little metaphors and its own little expressions that are unique to it. And if you speak the language, then you're privy to that deeper meaning that somebody else might not be. So, and it's the same thing with visual expression and verbal expression. There's some things you can express visually better than you can express verbally, or things that don't even have, like you mentioned, word equivalents for, and vice versa too. There are certain things that require a complex written narrative that you can't explain, that you can't express in a photograph or even in a portfolio of photographs. So I think the more media that's available to you, the greater your range of expression is. But I don't think you should expect this one-to-one parity between visual expression and verbal expression. That's just not a realistic expectation. The other part is a little more interesting, is that how do you know how to express things visually? And like I mentioned, right now, there is very little that we know about it. And we do know that a lot of it is going to be ambiguous because people bring their own subjective notions to how they form their impressions of a visual work when they look at a work of art. And so there's always going to be some degree that is beyond your control, no matter how good of a visual narrator you are. There's some things that you will never be able to express to all people unless it's extremely simplistic. I think you should just accept that. But as far as references, if you think of verbal expression and visual expression as languages, one of the downsides of the visual language is there isn't, and probably can't be, a dictionary for that language or some book of rules of grammar for it. There might be a degree of that, but you can never control the subjective meaning that every single viewer brings to that experience. So part of it is the beauty of art is it always leaves some range for people to fill in their own meaning. And I think that helps make it more meaningful to them, but not necessarily in the same way that it might be meaningful to you. No, I think you're muted, Katie.
Our last question before we get to your next passage comes from Jeffrey. What do you want your photos to say about you, or what messages do you want to convey for future generations through your photos?
I hope it's okay if I quote somebody else who had the perfect response to that. Let me find that. Oh. Okay, this is from the artist Gustave Courbet. He was a realist artist. When I am dead, let it be said of me, he belonged to no school, to no church, to no institution, to no academy, least of all any regime except the regime of liberty. So for me, it's just that I've lived and that it meant something to me, and that I tried to share some of that meaning with the world, but that's about all I care about.
What will you be reading for us next?
Okay, so this is from the second section of the book. This is from an article titled Us of the Minority. You know what? I think I skipped the first one, Katie. I apologize. Okay, so yeah, so earlier I read from the second section about commitment and doubt, but I was supposed to read from the first section. So I'm going to go back to that and read a piece of an article called What is Real? And I can look for the page number.
The page number in the book is page 49.
Okay.
For those who might have the book, they probably won't have the book because it just arrived at our warehouse.
Okay. So let me go back and find that. Okay, so this starts a little bit further into the article. Photography as a medium for art is disadvantaged compared with other media, but not because of photography's mechanics. The greatest disadvantage facing artists working in the medium of photography is the pervasive prejudice that photography's only valid and acceptable use is objective representation, scientific, journalistic work. Viewers of photographs have been led to believe that what they see in a photograph is what they would have seen themselves if present at the same place and time the photograph was captured. Photographs are commonly expected to serve primarily some utilitarian purpose, to be pictures of something before they are considered also perhaps to serve some expressive purpose, being about something. In the minds of many, a photograph first has to fall into some descriptive category, a street photograph, a landscape photograph, a portrait photograph, before it may be considered secondarily for any artistic merit that it may have. The notion that some photographs' primary, sometimes only purpose is artistic expression and not representation of some quality inherent in the objects portrayed is an odd one to many people. Still, this limited view of photography's range of expression is a matter of belief, not any handicap inherent in the capabilities of the medium itself. Alas, largely to blame for the limited acceptance of subjective expression in photography in photographs are attitudes promoted by some of the historical greats of the medium. Consider that it's been well over a century since such movements as realism and impressionism were considered contemporary in painting, about the same time as when pictorialism was the dominant style in photography, later to be supplanted by straight photography. If a painter today wanted to make impressionistic paintings, few would even think of deriding such work, despite the fact that impressionism is no longer the dominant style in painting. But try presenting a pictorial or other non-representational photograph in most mainstream media today, and you may find yourself assaulted and accused of such grave ethical violations as manipulation or photoshopping. For many consumers of photography, there is only one true way. In my mind, fundamentalism has no place in art, and to arbitrarily limit an artist's range and means of expression is, as a matter of principle, a bad idea. I'm a photographer and an artist. I'm also an avid consumer of photographic art. In my own work, realism and natural aesthetics are important, but not because I feel myself under any obligation to remain true to them. My work is faithful to realistic appearances to a significant degree, not always perfectly, because I choose for it to be so, given that my aim is to express moods I experience in remote and lonesome natural places, owed largely to the effects that such environments have on my psyche. Considering myself a creative artist, I strive to show my viewers images that venture beyond anything they may have seen themselves or that have been done by others. And I strive to be self-expressive in my work, meaning that the moods and feelings I wish to inspire in viewers are ones that I have felt, not contrivances or visual cliches manufactured for aesthetic appeal or popularity, but not rooted in a genuine emotional experience. As a consumer of artistic photographs, my sensibilities and tastes extend greatly beyond just the kinds of photographs I like making myself. The photographs that interest me most today are those designed primarily to express subjective moods, regardless of subject matter, rather than those that venture no further than to portray fortuitous objective appearances. When viewing a photograph presented as art, it doesn't bother me in the least if, to better accomplish a subjective expression, a photographer chose to depart to whatever degree from objective representation. In fact, I think that any creation worthy of the designation of art must involve such departure. Certainly, I have no expectation that the same composition or visualization would have been obvious to me in the same circumstances. That would mean that the photographer's imagination played little or no role in composing the photograph, making it uncreative and unartistic, even if pleasing in some other way. For any medium to be useful to an artist, it must allow a generous degree of plasticity. It must lend itself readily to subjective expression of concepts and feelings originating in the artist's mind, and not just those inherent in or commonly associated with the subject. In the words of Henry Peach Robinson, to the artist, there is no merit in a process that cannot be made to say the thing that is not. There is little doubt in my mind that photography is not such a medium. Photography absolutely provides ample room for subjective expression, up to and including repudiating entirely the objective reality of the things photographed. This is evident by, if nothing else, the prevalence of so many discussions about whether photography should be allowed to depart from realism, a moot point if photography wasn't capable of such departure. Indeed, there is no medium I know of, including photography, that is entirely limited by its nature to objective representation, having no ability to depart from realistic depiction and to be used as a means for subjective expression. Presented with this truism, some traditionalists may respond, people believe photographs. This may be true for many viewers of photography, but it also concedes that the expectation of realism is a matter of belief, not an imposition of the medium. Beliefs by their nature are matters of choice. If this weren't the case, the very idea of belief would be unnecessary. Progress demands that beliefs must on occasion be challenged, expanded on, and when appropriate, repudiated and abandoned in favor of more truthful or useful ones. It is appropriate to believe that photographs are realistic when these photographs are presented as realistic and can be verified as such. When presented as art, the more appropriate belief is that a photograph is intended to express a subjective truth, not an objective appearance. To believe otherwise would be at odds with the purpose of artistic expression and likely lead to justified or unjustified feelings of deception and disappointment. Put another way, people shouldn't believe photographs. They should believe photographers, at least those photographers who are honest about the kind of reality they strive to express: photojournalism, expressive art, postmodern abstractions, fictional worlds, or anything else. All are real in some sense. They are just not all real in the same sense.
Back. Well, photography as a medium for art is disadvantaged.
Mhm.
That brings to mind your quotation about Charles Baudelaire and when he wrote on photography at its inception and was concerned that it would be the death of creativity, the death of art.
The death of art, yes.
He judged it a little unfairly.
Well, at the time, realism was the dominant paradigm in painting, and artists or painters were judged by their ability to render very minute, accurate, realistic details. And suddenly here came a machine and a process that, at least in principle, could do it better without requiring much training or talent from the operator. And he thought that would have meant the death of art as it was at the time. But what in fact happened is that artists abandoned realism. That's what Impressionism was created to oppose. Impressionists just decided, okay, well, if a machine could do this realistic, detailed view of nature better than we can, then we're going to do something else. And so they started focusing on qualities of light and mood instead of fine details.
Right. We have an audience question from Alberto. He is a neighbor of ours in San Francisco. Alberto asks or says, you've mentioned in past talks and articles that there are certain visual techniques that can be employed to convey some emotions and other ideas using things, color, shape, composition. That seems intuitive and is backed by science, as you've mentioned. Do you think it's possible to communicate or express more complex ideas? Say, for example, the contemplation of your own mortality, purely through an image, or does it require accompanying work with words which are more suited for complex language and expression?
I definitely think it's possible, but whether it can be done decisively and unambiguously, probably not. Think of Edvard Munch's painting The Scream. That is extremely expressive of that mood of fear and frustration, right? So it can be done visually. Visuals can express very complex moods, sometimes better and more viscerally than any number of words can. But sometimes a combination of the two can be more effective. So unfortunately, there is no one answer for this question in every situation. Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't.
Some more questions from the live audience. Let's see. Ken says, in 2015, my wife and I had the good pleasure of visiting Israel. We found the landscape, cultural, historic, and religious diversity awe-inspiring. How do you think growing up in that environment affected your artistic creativity?
That's a little difficult for me to answer because I did not grow up in that environment. I grew up in a country that was very, very different from the country that you saw in 2015. When I was there, the population was much, much less. There were huge, vast tracts of fields and abandoned orchards after the wars, when a lot of the country was taken from former Palestinians and Arab residents. And so for me as a child, there was an enormous amount of places that I could just go and discover things that nobody else had seen, at least nobody that was still living there. Today, because the country is so small and there's so many people and so much of it has been developed and built over, many of these places that were part of my childhood just don't exist anymore. They're buried under buildings and roads. And for me, that was by the time I was a teenager, it didn't feel like the place that I loved anymore, and that played a big part of my decision to leave. It's just the things that I came to love as a child just didn't exist. I couldn't explore anymore. I couldn't go and roam in these big open spaces anymore. A lot of things were just developed and contained, and became tourist attractions. So yeah, it really wasn't the same place that I grew up in. So I know that might be an unfulfilling answer to you, but yeah, it's still a very awe-inspiring place, and the diversity of it is incredible. But it's not the place that I grew up in, that I grew up to love.
Colleen asks, what needs to happen, in your opinion, in the photography industry or in the world for landscape photography to progress beyond its current stagnant state?
Oh, that's a big question. What I think should happen and what I think is likely or feasible to happen might be two different things. I think right now there is a lot of template thinking in photography. Enormous amount of photographers just go to the same places to copy the same composition or the same styles. There's just not a lot of innovation. And unfortunately, the industry to a large degree rewards that. Things that are aesthetically pleasing, no matter how uncreative they are, get likes and awards and get published. And I think that that's to the detriment of creativity and expression, which to me are far more important or meritorious aspects of art. So yeah, I would like to encourage photographers to work more creatively and expressively and try to find things that have not been done before.
We have a follow-up question from another attendee, SciCat. Your writings do not anthropomorphize. Instead, I feel it is reverse anthropomorphism. Do you think you gradually moved in this direction, or do you always were so? But have you become better in expressing it over the years?
I think that's true. If you look at my life path, it's just been this one long journey to detach myself from the great mass of humanity and find more time and ways to spend times away from from cities, away from professional environments, and find these wild, unexplored places. So yeah, for me, to a large degree, photography and everything that I create are things that are apart from the human created world, the human manufactured world. So yeah, it's both been a process, and hopefully, since I've been doing it as long as I have, hopefully I've gotten better at it over the years.
We have about 15 minutes left. I think we could take some more questions now. We have plenty in the Q&A, or we could do another reading and finish up with some questions. Up to you.
Let's take a few more questions, because I think that's what people have come here for. They don't want to.
Okay. I mean, it is a reading and Q&A. We came for the reading.
Okay, so well, let's take a couple more questions and we'll do one more reading and see where that puts us.
Sounds good. I think we have some more process related questions. At least they sound process related to me. So I'm going to pull those up. So this one also has two parts, and this is from Paul, who would be a neighbor of yours from Sandy, Utah. Do you pre-visualize the color that you want to see in post-processing? Or do you pre-visualize more of the lines and form when you are composing an image in the field?
I visualize everything. I wouldn't click the shutter unless I had something in my mind of what the final image is going to look like. It doesn't mean that it will remain the same throughout the whole process. I might have an epiphany throughout the process and decide to take in a different direction. But at any given point in the process, I always have a very good idea of what I want it to look like at the end.
This follow-up is, what notes do you make in the field or shoot in a camera image to communicate to yourself later in post-processing what you were seeing or feeling in the field, so you can recreate that look and feel in post-processing?
I don't. The notes that I take in the field are for ideas that I generally want to think or write about. When it comes to photographs, when I bring up a photograph, coming back from the field, when I bring it up to work on it, I usually have no problem reconnecting with the experience of making it. I know exactly what I was after.
This is a question from your second passage that you were reading. When it occurs, how and why is photography a source of despair? Is it a manifestation of or an instigator to how you were feeling in life outside of photography? Do you try to breathe through that, or is that when you pull away?
Okay, so when I said that it's a source of despair, sometimes it's a source of despair because it doesn't happen the way that I want it to happen. And I realize that happens sometimes when I become too obsessed with, I need to photograph something. I'll be in a place where something is happening or something where I feel something meaningful, but there is just no way that I can, I just really, even if there is some composition that I think might work, I just really don't feel like doing it. I just want to be doing something else. So that might lead to a bit of despair. The other part of it is that sometimes I will make a photograph and I will think while I'm in the field that I have something that's is exactly what I want, and then I'll realize later that it's just not working. It's just not coming together. My visualization is not was not good enough to make an expressive photograph for me. So yeah, those would be the ones that I would characterize as despair. But yeah, usually my bigger problem is sometimes I'm in the throes of some experience and I know that I could make a good photograph, but I just don't want to. I just want to feel and do something else and or not even do anything at all and just experience it to the fullest.
Monica asks, is it harder to express happy feelings than not so happy feelings?
I don't know. I would think it's easier, but I would say that at least in my own mind, the ratio is not exactly 1-to-1. So I can't say that I have a scientific answer of which one works better.
Another question, Seshi asks, do you think putting your thoughts on paper in form of writing helps you to develop yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it forces me to think about things in a more structured way rather than just the chaos of ideas in my head and all the distractions around it. So when I write about something, I'm a lot more focused on it. I go out and research it. I try to make connections to other things and other ideas. So it definitely helped me digest and realize the full depth of, or greater depth of what I'm writing about than I would otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question from Deborah, and then maybe we can get one more reading from you.
Okay.
Deborah asks, how do you approach a photographic session?
A photographic, you mean making a photograph?
If I had to interpret this, I wonder if it's going into the field, preparing to go into.
So for me, I never go out with any photograph in mind. I just go out. I go out to experience, and if an experience inspires me to photograph, then I will make a photograph. But usually that's the process. Is I go out to be outside, to experience something, to see something, to be in a certain place, in a certain state where I'm open to inspiration. And then when something connects to some feeling in me or some realization or something inspires me in some way, then I will go about making a photograph. And the first part of that is the visualization and composition process. I don't even touch the camera until I have a really good idea in my mind of what I want the final image to be. And only then I will set up the camera and start the process.
Okay, so now I have a question. How often is it that you go out and come back without having made a photograph?
I would say at least half the time. But to put that in context, I spend a lot of time out. I probably spend about half my time or more outside. So I spend a lot of time outside, and about half of those trips, I don't come back with anything, but I'm going to be out again within a couple of days. So it doesn't bother me that much.
Yeah. Well, why don't we hear another reading from you? And I think
Okay.
there'll still be some time for some more audience questions after the reading.
Okay, so this one is from the third section of the book, which is called Bridging the Gap. And this article is Us of the Minority. And Katie, if you don't mind looking up the page for that while I find the text.
It is page 113.
Okay. Oops. Huh. Sorry, I ran into a bug in the Apple Books app. Mac users used to be snobs where things just work and Microsoft didn't, but that has definitely changed in the last few years. Okay, so this is from an article titled Us of the Minority. In teaching photography, my greatest challenge is not to explain technical concepts, but to instill in my students an attitude conducive to creative expression, an attitude of being constantly and defiantly inspired to create, despite ever-present distractions, mundane concerns, and sometimes unavoidable difficulties. This I must do, at least in part, by countering so many trends and incentives pointing photographers in the opposite direction. The photographic industry has given rise to an endless torrent of recipes, tips, and other shortcuts to aesthetic appeal, often at the expense of experience, creativity, and self-expression. Manufacturers tout how much their products can do by use of advanced technology with little effort or skill needed from the photographer. Software makers advertise proudly how their products can generate attractive visual effects without need to visualize, to experiment, to compose, to imagine. Marketing mavens pontificate about the virtues of mastering search algorithms, using hashtags, and building up large followings of mindless likers, sharers, and subscribers by way of photographs that are popular, formulaic, overly hyped, easily digestible, requiring no depth of engagement to understand and appreciate. Why, quote unquote, waste time seeking novelty, relating emotionally to one's experience, marveling unproductively at the beauty and complexity of existence, exploring beyond what's already known, challenging one's creative imagination, and risking photographic failure, or worse, unpopularity. Photographers want a formula for everything, wrote Henry Peach Robinson in 1896. More than 120 years later, this still holds true for most, but not all photographers. A minority of which I am a proud member cares little for formulas when it comes to the creative and expressive aspects of our work. We of the minority strive to give visual expression to notions of our own minds and to complex emotions arising from our own experiences, rather than seek short and easy paths to commonly popular aesthetics. For the achievement of this, wrote Paul Strand, referring to photographs that express personal meaning, there are no shortcuts, no formulae, no rules except those of your own living. There is necessary, however, the sharpest kind of self-criticism, courage, and hard work. Aldo Leopold's pioneering and influential book, A Sand County Almanac, has inspired me and many fellow naturalists and conservationists. Like so many creative and expressive photographers, so do many conservationists sometimes feel themselves in a minority, isolated, misunderstood, even tempted to give up. Leopold was no stranger to such feelings and acknowledged them in the very first page of his book. For us of the minority, he wrote, the opportunity to see geese is more important than television, and the chance to find a pasque flower is a right as inalienable as free speech. When feeling myself at odds with a majority opinion, I sometimes find it empowering to define to myself the minority I feel a part of, to write my own for us of the minority statement, to articulate, if only to myself, my reasons for being in this minority, the things I will not be tempted to compromise on, even while most others don't share the same priority. I am a naturalist first, a creative and self-expressive photographer second. For us of the minority, the opportunity to witness and to participate in wild beauty is more important than any camera technique, any piece of gear or software, any must-see attraction, any so-called rules, any tradition, and any measure of popularity, recognition, even legacy. For us of the minority, the welfare of our subjects is more important than photographing them. For us of the minority, the rewards of engaging in creative work are more important than impressing others with our photographs. For us of the minority, why we make our photographs is more important than how we make our photographs.
Thank you for reading that passage. Doesn't feel like there's anything else that can be said after that, but we have more questions.
Mic drop, yeah.
Yeah, how important it is to have an antithetical statement to the corporate statement. Well, we have some audience questions about if you're going to be teaching in the near future.
Yes, I usually offer 3 or 4 workshops each year.
Okay, do you have any upcoming? Sally wants to know if you're offering a class on post-processing.
No, not post-processing. We used to, when I say we, I mean me and my business partner, Michael Gordon. We used to offer post-processing classes, but we decided that really our niche is more trying to inspire creative and expressive photography and helping people relate to the natural wonders that we explore, helping them relate photographically. I just feel that there's a lot of very, very good technical teaching out there. It's just not a niche that is important for me to explore, and I don't enjoy it as much.
Chuck has a very important question. Hey Guy, I had to put the camera away when COVID came along. For over 2 years, I didn't capture or create an image. I'm about to enter a new chapter in life, and I'm trying to reconnect with my creative side. I could use a jump start. What suggestions might you offer beside a one-way ticket to Cedar Mesa?
Wow. Yeah, I've been through phases like that, and that's they're very consequential, and yeah, I can relate to the feeling, Chuck, and I sincerely hope and I trust that you will find that. As to what might might prompt you to do that, it's hard to say. I know for me, it was always something completely unexpected. It was something that I encountered in a book, or something that I encountered while out hiking, or some epiphany that I had. So the best advice that I have is to, as the saying goes, put yourself in the path of opportunity. Find reading that inspires you. Look at art that inspires you. I don't know specifically what is limiting you at the time, so it's hard for me to suggest anything specific. But if not Cedar Mesa, surely there's somewhere you can go to at least get a breath of fresh air and good smells of natural things, and revel in weather or something, and try to find that trigger. But I guess the best advice that I have is to not to make it worse. And by making it worse, it means to give up hope and to just think, well, I have nowhere to look. I've tried everything and nothing works. You never know what would work. So just stay as open as you can and try to consume as much as you can and see as much as you can. Look, read, go out, experience. Something eventually is going to click. And since I know Chuck, I know that he's a naturalist. He's one who's inspired by the natural world and the natural landscape and by poetic feelings. And so those things are out there. One of them eventually will call out to you. So really just keep at it and don't despair.
This might be on the other end of the spectrum of inspiration, but Psycat asks, do you allow yourself to get bored?
No, I boredom for me is an awful state that I can't. I have to constantly feed my brain. I have to constantly think about things and try new things. So I'm never bored. I can't be.
And this was our first question of the evening that we're going to answer. Could you please suggest additional reading on the concept of equivalence? This comes from George, who I think has read the whole book. So.
Okay, that's a tough one because I'm not aware of any books that are directly about equivalence. And so When it comes to photography, there have been over the years a few really good books that are just collections of great essays by great photographers. And unfortunately, some of them are out of print, but you can probably find them used. One is by Vicky Goldberg. It's called Photography in Print. It's a pretty thick book, dozens of photographers represented, just really great writings about photography. I'm sure equivalence is covered there in at least a couple of those articles. There is another collection that was put together by a photographer named Nathan Lyons. It's called Photographers on Photography. It's really good. A few years ago, there came out an anthology of Aperture magazine. It's called The Minor White Years. And if you're familiar with Minor White, you know that he was a huge proponent of equivalence. A lot of articles in that anthology are about equivalence. So yeah, somewhere in those, I'm sure you will find a lot of very useful information.
Great. So we're going to ask our last question from Robert. He says, you spoke of your legacy. If you had your choice, would you prefer to know more for your photography or for your writing? And do you feel that one of these is higher art form than the other?
Well, maybe the answer is not going to be satisfying. My friend, the editor of Lens Work, Brooks Jensen, told me a couple of times that he's worried that he'll end up being remembered as a publisher when he's really a very, very good photographer. He publishes because he's a photographer. But I have to admit that I don't really care about it that much. I think I have some important things to pass on, and whether I'm remembered for it personally, for any accomplishment, is really not that important to me. The important thing for me is I get to live this life that just amazes me every day. It's higher than anything I could dream about as a child. So I already got mine just by having this life and by being able to do what I do. So whatever I'm remembered for or not remembered for is not all that important to me.
Well said. Thank you so much, Guy, for this book. There's really great feedback from the audience in the chat that we'll have a chance to read. Audience, this book is available pretty soon. It's just hit our warehouses. Guy has copies for sale on his website, and it's available on rockynook.com. You can get it for 40% off with our coupon. But we also encourage you to order from Guy, support him as the artist and author. And please visit his website. It's guytal.com.
Thank you very much, everybody, and especially to you, Katie, and to Rocky Nook for making this possible.
Thank you. And thank you so much, audience, for all your participation. Your questions were wonderful. And it's been a delight interacting with everyone. So take care and have a great evening.